voy a honrar. Vengo a honrar a mi patria, Venezuela, única, grande, ejemplar, una tierra generosa, amigable y muy cordial, donde el sol se manifiesta dándonos brillo especial, porque se le den que Dios nos hizo.
Venezuela es mi lugar. Venezuela is my place. Gerardo Valentin. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, Juan Gonzalez, our guest, Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C., and Miguel Tinker Salas, professor at Pomona College. Juan?
Well, Michael Shifter, I want to ask you, you said that you expect that there will be at some point over the next few months an election for a successor to Chavez. It looks likely that way, and that Chavez, before he went into the hospital, anointed Nicolas Maduro, who is actually the appointed vice president, not the elected vice president, as his preferred successor. But the Constitution says that if he's incapacitated, it should be the head of the National Assembly who takes office. Also a Chavista. Could you talk about these two figures and the differences between them, perceived either by the opposition or even within the Chavista camp?
Well, I think they're the two principal figures within Chavismo. Nicolás Maduro is somebody who was previously a union leader. He was in the National Assembly. He was president of the National Assembly. He's been foreign minister for the last 6 years. He is close, strong contacts with the Cuban government. Cabello is a military figure and is very close to factions within the armed forces. He has a very different background than Maduro does. But for the purposes, so they are the leading figures of a faction. I mean, Chavez was the only figure that could really unify the whole movement. Because of his charisma, because of his authority, and just very astute political operations, he was able to do that. No figure becomes close to him. These are the two principal ones that remain. Maduro will be the candidate because Chavez has designated him as such, but Cabello is going to play a very, very important role. The armed forces is a very important institution in Venezuela. Chavez came from the armed forces, Cabello does, and so you're going to see a situation where you're going to have to work out deals and agreements and understandings led by Maduro, but also Cabello would be in there playing an important role. Now, to the extent that they could keep this together over time, I think is a major question. Chavez was uniquely capable of doing that, and especially if there's a very acute economic crisis and fiscal pressures, you may begin to see some real very serious infighting among the different factions of Chavismo, which of course would weaken the capacity of the government to sustain itself.
Professor Tinker Salas, can you respond to Michael Shifter and also talk about the significance of Hugo Chavez, what you think he has meant for Venezuela?
Well, I think fundamentally Chavez has changed the landscape, but it's not just Chavez. I mean, the reality is that in 1998, Venezuela, when Chavez was elected, was at a crisis point. There had been a series of economic crises that people had lost all faith in the political apparatus. There was a crisis of legitimacy. There was increasing social discontent. Over 85% of the population, according to a poll published in the New York Times, thought that the national government had mishandled the oil economy and society. So again, Chavez has brought to power on a wave of tremendous social and political discontent. And I think what he has done is, and not only him, but the social movements in Venezuela have transformed the political landscape. I don't think there's any going back in Venezuela. I think any illusions that the opposition can return to a pre-1998 Chavez era are simply gone. And not only has Chavez helped transform Venezuela, but his impact within Latin America has been tremendously significant. The presence of Mujica, of Ortega, and of Morales in Venezuela on his portended inauguration speak to his impact in Latin America, and I think it has been significant in terms of the creation of a series of forums such as UNASUR, the CELAC, the Union of South American Nations, the Community of Latin American Nations, the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance. Now, internally, in terms of Maduro and Cabello, they represent two sides that complement each other to a very important extent. Maduro comes out of the social movements. He is a student leader. He is a union leader. He has been in the National Assembly. He helped draft the Constitution. Foreign Minister. Cabello, on the other hand, comes out of the civic military tradition that exists in Venezuela, which is very much unlike other countries in Latin America, where you've had a progressive military dating back to the 1950s and 60s and 70s, who have taken sides with social movements. So both of them, in many ways, complement each other in projecting future of the Chavista movement in Venezuela.
And Miguel Tinker Salas, the importance of what happens in Venezuela, people forget that that Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, greater than even Saudi Arabia, and therefore it has an enormous impact on the oil politics across the planet. Could you talk about that and how Chavez used that oil wealth to further the social aims of his revolution?
Well, if we think back simply, where was Venezuela before 1998? We hardly heard about Venezuela. It was a faithful ally of the U.S. It was always voting with the U.S. and the OAS and the UN. Venezuela was known for having a supply of oil, an array of very good baseball players, winning the meaningless Miss Universe contest on a regular basis. But other than that, Venezuela really did not have a real big footprint on the regional map or on the international map. That dramatically changes with Chavez, and it changes because of the social policy. It changes because of the fact that one of the first policies Chavez implemented is, when in office by around 2001, began to re-examine oil policy and found that a tremendous amount of the oil that Venezuela had in reserves was being classified as shale, that is, as oil sands. And again, reclaiming the national oil company, revising the contracts with those foreign oil companies, and reclassifying the reserves has in fact given Venezuela the largest oil deposit in the world, with potentially much more oil, 500 billion barrels potentially in the future, which means again that Venezuela's role in terms of oil in rebuttressing OPEC and establishing energy alliances in Latin America with Petrosur and Petrocaribe have been fundamentally in altering the policy, and then in taking those reserves and implementing a series of social programs. Granted, the opposition will claim that that money is being misspent, but the reality is, for Venezuelans on the ground, it has improved their lifestyle. Poverty has been decreased by over 20%. Destitute poverty has come down to nearly 8%. There has been food programs. There have been health programs. There have been aid for pregnant mothers. There has been pension plans. There has now been a new housing program that is responsible for a 20% growth in construction, which has now given Venezuela 5.5 growth during 2012. So we've seen a dramatic change, and that's what gives the Chavez movement support, and that's what continues to fuel much of the Chavista social movements and process.
But Michael Shifter, you've been critical of some of this economic growth, and you've raised the issue in some of your writings that it's been that Chavez failed to diversify the economy. But there is the reality that Venezuela now has the lowest income inequality in Latin America. Could you expound on some of your concerns about the economic development that has occurred under Chavez?
Well, I think the results of Chavez, I think in this day and age, if you have a system of governance and a model where one person makes all the decisions, as we've seen in 14 years under Chavez, it's very, very hard to deliver effective results. Oil production, in fact, has declined dramatically in Venezuela. And Venezuela has failed to diversify its economy. It's more dependent on oil, but oil has gone, the production of oil has gone down. Venezuela imports everything. It doesn't produce anything. So this is an economy that is really dependent on a single commodity that is not performing well. There's very little investment, and there's very little coming into the country. And we've seen the results. It has the highest inflation in Latin America. We all know from Latin American history that inflation hits the poor the hardest. This is Chavez's own constituency. It has an enormously high fiscal deficit. It has. It's true that the well-being of Venezuelans generally has improved since 1998 when Chavez came in. When Chavez came in 1998, 1999, oil was $10 a barrel. Now it's gone well over $100. So he has really ridden this tremendous increase in the price of oil, and he really had a tremendous opportunity because of his charisma, because of his connection with Venezuelans, and because of the money that he had to spend. But being the fact that he has really made all the decisions himself and has discouraged a lot of private investment, has been very confrontational. and very much of a polarizing figure. He hasn't left Latin America more united. It's true that Latin America is much more self-confident, more assertive, has enormous pride. I think Chavez deserves credit for contributing to that. But it's also a region where there's tremendous fragmentation and there's a lot of discord. And I think Chavez, as a polarizing figure, at the same time has also been responsible for that situation as well.
In December 2009, I caught up with President Chavez for a few minutes at the UN Climate Change Summit in Copenhagen. I asked him what level of emissions reductions he was willing to support.
100%.
100%.
100%.
100%. We must reduce the emissions 100%. In Venezuela, the emissions are currently insignificant compared to the emissions in developing countries. We are in agreement. We must reduce all the emissions that are destroying the planet. However, that requires a change in lifestyle, a change in the economic model. We must go from capitalism to socialism. That's the real solution.
How do you throw away capitalism?
The way they did it in Cuba. That's the way. The same way we are doing in Venezuela. Giving the power to the people and taking it away from the economic elites.
Solo se puede hacer a través de una revolución.
You can only do that through a revolution.
I also asked President Chavez what he thought of the U.S. government calling him a dictator.
I laugh. I laugh. It is the empire calling me a dictator. I'm happy. And I remember Don Quixote. Quixote who was with Sancho, you know, and the dogs start to bark, and Sancho says, they are going to bite us. And Quixote wisely answers, take it easy, Sancho, because if the dogs are barking, it is because we are galloping.
Yo estaría muy triste.
I would be very sad and worried
If
the imperialist government was calling me a great democratic man. No, it is them, the empire, who attack those who are truly contributing to the real democracy.
Muchas gracias, tenemos que irnos.
That was President Chavez in Copenhagen in December of 2009. Let me get the response of Professor Salas Tinker to that. Tinker Salas to that.
Tinker Salas. I think that there has been an effort in Venezuela to promote green energy, to promote environmental consciousness. There's a lot more to do. Venezuela is very wasteful in terms of oil. Cars consume a tremendous amount of carbon monoxide. So there's a tremendous amount that needs to be done. There's a beginning consciousness about the environment, but there's also a legacy of 100 years in the oil industry that has really damaged the environment of the country. So there's a lot to be done in terms of the country. But in terms of what Mr. Shifter said previously, Venezuela's deficit is not out of line with the rest of Latin America. Its public debt, it's less than 7.8%. I'm sorry, its fiscal debt is less than 7.8%. Its public debt is about 45%, way in line with debt ceilings in terms of Latin America. And Latin America today is more united than ever before. You didn't have 12 years ago the Union of South American Nations. You didn't have CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations. You didn't have Latin Americans resolving their own internal affairs, as was the case in Bolivia when part of Bolivia's right wing attempted to separate from Bolivia, and you had the president of Chile calling for a meeting of presidents and making a declaration about the integrity of Bolivia. I think that it really speaks to the fact that Latin America is today confident, united in ways we have never seen before, and I think that Venezuela has played an important role in that as an advocate for regional integration.
Michael Shifter, what about all of these changes at the regional level that Venezuela has helped spearhead? And also, when you mentioned that they have not diversified in terms of oil as their main source of income, they have diversified where their oil goes. Something like 600,000 barrels a day of Venezuelan oil now go to China, as opposed to the United States or Western Europe. Your sense of how the impact of Venezuela on regional politics?
Well, first of all, on the oil, it's true that there's some oil that goes to China, but not nearly as much as Chavez has. When Chavez came in, he claimed that he was going to do a lot more in diversifying the markets. The fact is that that Venezuela is still very heavily dependent on the U.S. market, and because of the crude oil, because of the refinery system, it's closer, it's cheaper, and for a variety of reasons. And of course, that is the main irony and contradiction of the whole U.S.-Venezuela relationship, is that while political relations have been very tense and full of strain, the oil keeps flowing, and Venezuela keeps selling, and the United States keeps buying it. So that I think is is a situation where I think the shift of the market really hasn't happened very much. I don't see, if one looks at these regional organizations, CELAC, UNASUR, there's no question that there has been increasing independence, distancing from the United States, from Latin America, especially South America. This has to do with other factors besides Chavez, although Chavez has been part of it. The rise in commodity prices, the rise of Brazil, the role of Brazil has been extremely, extremely significant. But if one looks at a lot of issues on economic questions, political questions, there are tremendous frictions between many Latin American countries. There's a lot of discord. There's a lot of disunity. There are conflicts between Chile and Peru. There are conflicts between a lot of different countries on a lot of different issues. There are trade problems between Argentina and Brazil today. So I don't think the fact that these organizations exist and have existed for a couple of years, it still remains to be seen how effective they're going to be. They're very new, and I think that there are a lot of differences, and I think that Chavez has been a polarizing force that has led to a lot of fragmentation in Latin America. I see a more self-confident region, a more assertive region with greater pride, and as I said before, Chavez is part of that, but at the same time, it's fragmented, and I also think he has been a factor in contributing to that tendency as well.
Juan Gonzalez and I interviewed Nicolas Maduro Moros in October 2007, when he then served as Hugo Chávez's foreign minister. It was a year after Chávez had famously referred to then-President George W. Bush as the devil in a speech before the United Nations, saying, quote, "The devil came here yesterday. It smells like sulfur today." I asked Maduro what message he had for the United States.
Our message is a message, first of all, to draw a balance, of what has happened over the last months in the world, what happened in the world, what's been the role of the United Nations to guarantee peace, how much the world has lost as a result of this crazy policy that is apparently will be prolonged with this attack against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Could reach a crazy level if we pretend to take the way of war to to attack the Iranian people. Our message remains the same. The world should open their eyes. The U.S. society should react. The U.S. people can do a lot for peace, for stability in the planet, for the recovery of the planet. The awareness in the world today, it's also expressed in the United States. And we need a large, humane alliance between the U.S. people and the peoples of the world, respecting our diversity, cultural diversity, our different ways to see the world. and establishing a relationship of equality. That's the main message, and this has been the message of President Chavez a year ago.
Venezuelan Foreign Minister Nicolas Maduro Moros, thank you. Current Vice President Nicolas Maduro, speaking to us when he was Foreign Minister in 2007 in New York City. Miguel Tinker Salas, talk about what the U.S. relationship has been with Chavez, both under Bush and now under President Obama, and where Maduro fits into that.
Well, I think, as you underscored in the piece before this, Maduro has been the foreign minister. And Maduro has been very important in reestablishing relationships with neighboring Colombia. He's credited with, in fact, mending fences at a time when a previous administration by Álvaro Uribe was very confrontational towards Venezuela, and they almost came to the point of breaking relationships. So that relationship has been, in fact, buttressed. And in that sense, Maduro has played a very important role in managing Venezuela's foreign relationships with China, with the countries of the region, with which Venezuela maintains very good relationships. And the fact that we're going to see the different presidents of Latin America today visiting Caracas and others visiting Cuba to see Hugo Chávez speaks to the fact of Venezuela's importance in the region, speaks to the fact that it's now gained a new prominence, speaks to the fact that Hugo Chávez's policy reintegrated Venezuela into Latin America. If you think back again to 1998, Venezuela really did not look south. It only looked north. It looked abroad. Its elites looked abroad. And I think the election of Hugo Chávez forced a very much of an inward look into Venezuela and a lot of self-reflection about Venezuela's relationship with the rest of Latin America, with the continent, with the region, back to what some would call its Bolivian roots. And I think that has been a very important contribution. And there's today a sense within Venezuela of its position within Latin America, a reclaiming of its status, of its position. And I think that's very, very important in the context of Latin America and U.S.-Latin American relations, because that, in fact, has informed how the U.S. has treated Venezuela. At first, the Bush administration's policy under Condoleezza Rice was to inoculate Latin America from Venezuela, as if Venezuela had some sort of disease that could spread. Unfortunately, the Obama administration promised much and delivered little. It continued the same Bush-era policies, and we've seen very much of a continuity between Bush and Obama. One is heartened to hear that in November, the U.S. and Venezuela opened up back channels and began conversation about the possibility of establishing new relationships and of exchanging ambassadors. And I think that's very positive, and one looks forward to that.
And Miguel Tinker Salas, what are you, in the next few days and weeks, what will you be looking for in terms of signs of what's going to happen in Venezuela? Clearly, the government has taken the position that really only if President Chavez is out of commission for 90 days, and then they can actually renew that for another 90 days. So there's basically a 180-day period where he could be incapacitated before they would have to actually be forced to take action in terms of new elections. You talk about what you're looking for.
Well, I think that we're going to see the opposition continue the campaign. I think they're going to continue to claim that there's a constitutional crisis. I think they're going to try to see if they can create, if divisions exist between Maduro and Cabello. None have been evident, but I think they're going to try to play on potential contradictions. They're going to continue to increase the international media campaign and pressure to try to depict Venezuela as in the midst of a crisis. But again, let me underscore that this has been part of a process for the last 14 years. We've seen an opposition that for 14 years has been projecting Venezuela on the edge of the precipice, on the verge of a crisis. And the reality is that life goes on a normal basis. Most Venezuelans continue to operate irregardless of whatever the opposition or the government is saying. So I think I expect to see a process of transition. I think increasingly we're beginning to see what Chavismo without Chavez might look like. But I don't see the country entering a crisis. I don't see the country at the edge of a precipice. I think that's an awful lot of a discourse that's being promoted by the opposition and unfortunately being picked up by the international media.
And Michael Shifter, how would you see the next few weeks or months, recalling that there were all of these forecasts that once Fidel Castro passed from the scene that Cuba would change dramatically, but that hasn't seemed to have happened so far?
Well, I think that my sense is that there's going to be an election. I think we're in a period where, again, the government's trying to consolidate its position, assert its authority. My sense is that Maduro is going to be the key figure. But I also get a sense that the government doesn't want to wait too long for to have elections. I think that they have the advantage to the extent the elections could take place sooner rather than later. And I think they have the edge against the opposition. The opposition is demoralized after its defeats in October and December. They're operating in a context where Chavez is clearly. I can't imagine that Chavez is going to come back. I think that he may resign in the next couple of weeks, or at least indicate that he really is not in any position to resume the office of the presidency. And so there'll be elections that will take place. That's why Chavez designated Maduro. He acknowledged that himself. And I think that the Chavismo is in a strong position. I think that there are serious, profound problems in Venezuela, and I think that economic problems, security problems, other problems. Chavez spent a lot of money in the campaign to win in October, and I think there is a serious fiscal imbalance and fiscal deficit. I think there'll probably be a devaluation of some sort or some economic measures that will need to be taken if Maduro is elected the next president. But that's what we're going to see. I don't see any imminent collapse or crisis. I think the Chavismo is in a strong position. I think the opposition hasn't been doing well recently, and they certainly suffered a big blow in October and December. But I do think that if one looks from now until 8 months from now or a year from now, I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see to what extent Chavismo without Chavez can really maintain its unity. I think there may be serious differences between Cabello and Maduro and other leaders within Chavismo, particularly within the context of very, very acute economic problems. And so that is what I would look for in the longer term. But I think in the shorter term, I think Chavismo is in a very strong position.
I wanted to just end on a historical note, going back in time a decade ago. An excerpt of a documentary made by two filmmakers who were in Caracas during the attempted coup of 2002. The film was called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. The excerpt begins with then White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer.
Let me share with you the administration's thoughts about what's taking place in Venezuela. We know that the action encouraged by the Chavez government provoked this crisis. The Chavez government suppressed peaceful demonstrations, fired on unarmed, peaceful protesters, resulting in 10 killed and 100 wounded. That is what took place, and a transitional civilian government has been installed.
Despite the blackout by the Venezuelan private media, members of Chavez's government have managed to communicate with international television networks, getting the message back to Venezuela via cable TV that Chavez had not resigned and was being held captive. The palace guard, who had remained loyal to Chavez, decided to act. Behind Carmona's back, a plot was being hatched by Chavez's men to retake the palace. The plan was for the guard to take up key positions, surround the palace, and to wait for a given signal. With all their positions secured, the signal was given, and the Presidential Guard moved in. Several members of the newly installed government were taken prisoner, but in the confusion, Carmona and the generals had managed to slip away. As the guards secured the building, Chavez's ministers, who had been in hiding for the last 2 days, began to arrive back to the palace to try and re-establish the legitimate cabinet.
A clip from the documentary The Revolution will not be televised, and of course we'll continue to follow developments in Venezuela as Hugo Chávez remains ill with cancer in Cuba. We want to thank Miguel Tinker Salas, professor at Pomona College in Claremont, California, and Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.